All right, so if you have any questions, please feel free to email me, or if there's any announcements that you'd like for me to post to the homepage, please let me know that as well. So now that we've covered operational definitions, let's move into a little bit more about specifying problems and coming up with a measurement and recording plan. So I'm just going to review from our goals table. Again, specifying a client's problem is what brought him in today. And this is different from an operational definition, which is, again, the frequency of the behavior and within a specified time frame. And if you want a little bit more explanation, again, watch the goals table video. So operational definition, again, is taking that client concern and putting it in quantifiable, measurable terms. And the verifying resources are people who can verify whether or not the measurement is accurate. And we also talked about coming up with goals, intermediate goals, and facilitative goals in the previous video, as well as coming up with an intervention, how to link that to the operationally defined problem. But let me go back and clarify a muddy point that some people have talked about in previous semesters. So every semester I've taught this, people have gotten a little bit confused about what exactly an operational definition is versus what a goal is versus a client concern. So when we're thinking about operationally defined problems, again, they're the number of times the behavior occurs within a unit of time. It could be the client score on a standardized measure, but again, it would be something that was time specific. So a standardized measure of their depression, the Beck Depression Inventory on a weekly basis, so whatever their score is per week, that could be an operationally defined problem of their depression. It could also be the amount of something, the amount of money spent on gambling, the number of standard drinks per week. Those would both be examples of operationally defined problems. All right, so as far as goals, as opposed to just talking about how we're going to go about measuring something, goals specify direction, which we're trying to change the behavior. So goals are always going to be defined as far as increasing a behavior, getting to a score on a standardized measure, or changing the amount of times somebody does something. Could also be decreasing it, so exactly like I just said, but decreasing the behavior. Or trying to get rid of it altogether. So you'll hear about behavioral extinction, that's just trying to get rid of something, trying to get rid of the problem. So a brief review, again, we're trying to put a tape measure to a behavior, which can be really challenging, right? Because we can put a tape measure to my height and that'll be very valid, reliable. But when we're trying to measure behaviors, we're trying to modify behaviors, or trying to extinguish behaviors, it can be a little bit muddier, right? All right, so maybe a good example of, again, for your homework assignment, you're going to have to do these. To complete a goals table for a client who's got a pathological gambling disorder. So I shared an example of one of these from my previous video, and maybe you can use that as a foreground for your homework assignment. So in practice evaluation, I'm going to be using this diagram a few times throughout the semester, but just thinking about the big picture of practice evaluation. So when we meet with a client, we're going to be covering goals, measurement, evaluation design, and how to do the analysis. So once we have an operationally defined problem and we have a goals table, it's best to use two different sources of measurement. And for your assignment and for your course paper, I'm going to ask you to use two sources of measurement for your project. So a good measurement and recording plan is always going to have the following elements: the name of the measures, who will be collecting the client data, when and where the data will be collected, how often the data will be collected. And finally, the procedures of the measurement and recording plan should be standardized. And what I mean by this is that you want to specify who's going to be collecting it, when, how often. So if somebody's going to be continuing with your single system design, they can pick up where you left off. And it also helps to make sure that you're using the same type of methods throughout the entire meeting with your client, and so that you can kind of explain what you've been working with them on as well. All right, so with our measurement recording plan, before we get into graphs, again, just remembering that the horizontal line on a graph represents the time that's passed, and the vertical lines represent the amount of behavior. And so what would you do with a missing data point? If you're looking at a graph and you've perhaps missed a week of data, what you would do is take the number of behaviors before the missed week and the number of behaviors after the missed week, and then do the moving average of the two. So if somebody had 5 drinks per day on Tuesday, missed recording on Wednesday, and then had 7 drinks on Thursday, you could say that they were probably going to drink 6 drinks on Wednesday, and that would be taking the moving average. Okay, so in your slides, you probably saw the reference to the group exercise. And this is what I'm referring to. So as you get a chance, I'd like for you to try to do this. You can post your attempt on the discussion forum, but you don't have to, because I know it can be kind of challenging to do that with this. Like, you'd probably have to scan it in. But if you want to give this a shot, just to see what your understanding of how to use a graph is, that would be appreciated. I'll also show an example of this filled out. Before I finish up talking about this, is that there's two sources of data. So we've got John's data on the left and Collateral's data on the right, which might be his spouse or something along those lines. So again, that would just be the two different forms of measurement. The client's own measurement versus their collateral's measurement. So you can measure behaviors, thoughts, and actual behavior, smoking or drinking, either by frequency, how many times you're having a negative thought, how many times you're smoking. It could be by duration or intensity. But how do you go about measuring behaviors like that? So you could either do it directly by observing somebody, observing kids having outbursts in class. That would be an example of a direct observation. You could also do it retrospectively. So asking somebody to think about, in the past month, how many times had you had an argument with your wife? It could be objectively by a direct observation again, or it could be subjectively, asking by somebody felt something, how somebody felt about something. So behavioral observation measures count how often a certain behavior occurs during a specified period of time, just like those operational definitions we had been talking about with our goals table. Behavioral observations can also measure the duration or amount of symptoms. So if somebody's having 10 negative thoughts a day, what if those 10 negative thoughts were an hour long? What if they were a minute long? So it's important to specify not only the frequency, but also the duration at times. And so thinking about how you can get an accurate behavioral observation includes specifying exactly what the behavior is. So in terms of when it begins, when it ends, what is a standard drink? 12 ounces of beer, 1.5 ounces of hard liquor. So defining exactly what that problem behavior is and how we're going to go about measuring it. And regardless of whether you're using frequency, duration, behavioral observations can have continuous recording or behavioral samples. So continuous observation would be looking at somebody's behavior throughout the day, throughout the week. And usually that's done by self-report. So how many cigarettes have you smoked per day for the past week? That would be the client actually reporting that themselves. But behavioral sampling, let's say if you're working with a kid who's in a public school and having a lot of outbursts, a behavioral sample might be dropping in on that school and seeing how many outbursts is he having during this hour. Maybe dropping in once before lunch, once after lunch, and seeing if it has something to do with the teacher. By doing the sampling, we can see what their behavior looks like without them actually reporting or doing a self-report. So behavioral observations can be performed by the client, the practitioner, or the relevant other. So in this scenario, we can talk about having collateral observations, such as having a different family member do the observation, or a spouse or a coworker do the observation. Behavioral observations can be really simple. They can be something about just monitoring a really basic behavior, or they can be a little bit more complex. So when thinking about behavioral observations, again, remember the concepts of validity and reliability. So how do you think you could get a behavioral measurement to be more valid? As opposed to just asking somebody to talk about how many cigarettes they've smoked over the past 24 hours, they might feel a little bit of shame about how much they've drank or how much they've smoked. So again, just reminding the client that this is for their benefit, right? So the only reason that you're collecting this data is for the purposes of helping to better serve the client. So if they're worried about you judging them, they might be a little bit less accurate in their report. So it's always important to try to encourage the client that this is for their best interests, and making sure that you're not going to be judging them, or that they understand that they're not going to be judged, but again, that this is for the purposes of trying to get them to the goals that they're trying to reach.